Hello, and welcome to this screencast on metacognition skills. This word metacognition may be new to you. If it is, think of it informally as learning to learn. I developed this screencast because I teach upper-level accounting courses. They're quite challenging, and so I frequently have students ask me how they can improve their learning and their grades. I've had several students adopt these metacognition skills to their benefit. They've substantially improved their grades and their learning. That piqued my interest watching their performance change. And so I've spent the last year and a half, 2 years, reading numerous articles, books, and research studies on metacognition. And I thought it made sense to summarize everything that I've read and learned in this screencast, and in particular focus on metacognition skills that you can implement starting today. I think it'll be beneficial to you, particularly if you're new to college or in college and essentially learning full-time. My name's Steve Orpert, and I'm a professor at Arizona State University. A lot of people just call me Prof or Prof-O or Prof-Zero. If you want to find me, a quick Google search will do it. To begin developing your metacognition skills, do the following. Stop this screencast. Download a PDF copy of the slides. They're in the first comment section. And preview what's to come. But preview in a specific way. Don't just flip through the slides, passively looking at the topics. Instead, actively ask and write down by hand several questions that you'd like to see answered during the screencast. By doing so, it helps you actively learn the material. If I don't happen to answer those questions, put them in the comments section and I will answer them there. Let's take a look at a little background information before we get into the specific skills themselves. Ask yourself this important question. Do you tend to believe that intelligence is fixed? That someone is either born smart or not? I think it's an important question because in my life experience, a vast number of people believe that it is fixed, yet the research results point to a different conclusion. They point to the idea that your intelligence can grow. And for it to grow, a key attribute is the idea of adopting a growth mindset. You might think of a growth mindset as a focus on learning. The idea is similar to the idea of strengthening a muscle. If you wanted to strengthen your arms, let's say, you wouldn't just go to the gym and loiter around and expect to come out with strong arms. No, you'd embrace an effortful, thoughtful, disciplined strengthening program, and improving your intelligence and your learning is the same idea. In other words, intelligence is an effortful process, not a thing, but effort itself isn't enough. You need discipline and thoughtful programs, i.e. the metacognition skills, to build your intelligence and your learning. Building on that, let's take a little deeper look at this idea of a growth mindset. Do you know people who tend to exhibit a fixed mindset or a growth mindset? In my experience, people tend to show one or the other rather frequently. Those that show a fixed mindset tend to want to look smart. As a result, they avoid effort, they avoid obstacles, they avoid challenges, and minimize or avoid negative criticism that could be useful to them. On the other hand, people with a growth mindset see effort as a path to mastery. When there are obstacles, they persist. When there are challenges, they embrace them. And when they're criticized, they learn from that criticism. As a result, people with a growth mindset tend to achieve more. People with a fixed mindset tend not to live up to their full potential. So a key to growing your intelligence and learning is to move yourself into an idea of a growth mindset. There's a lot to learn here. And so a quick Google search will turn up numerous articles that will help you, and I'd encourage you to do that. Interestingly, research also indicates that those that we view as intelligent may, in large part, not totally, but in large part, have learned to learn better than others. And so I think it's important to study these metacognition skills and embrace them. At the same time, research also shows that learning itself is a skill. Metacognition is the word. And many of us, this includes me previously, hopefully I'm a little better now, many of us learn poor learning habits, and they limit our development. So the takeaway coming out of this research is quite compelling in my view. That is, improving your metacognition skills will help you learn better and improve your intelligence. And at least in my experience, it appears to work. Let's start in on the metacognition skills. The first skill that you want to master is to monitor your learning. And the best way to do that is with Bloom's taxonomy. You can take a look at this chart, this illustration here. The question you want to ask yourself is which level of Bloom's do you typically learn at? It probably won't surprise you that many of my students seem to be learning at the lower levels of Bloom's. They remember and they understand. In other words, they study to recall facts and basic concepts, and they study to explain ideas and explain concepts, but they don't practice learning at the higher levels of Bloom's. And as a result, when they take an exam, their learning tends to be somewhat superficial and perhaps elusive when the exam is placed in front of them. What they need to do, and what I'd encourage you to do, is focus on moving your learning up Bloom's. Practice and think about applying the learning that you're doing. In other words, try to use information in new situations. Analyze it. Draw connections amongst ideas. And same thing with evaluate and create. So the key here as a metacognition skill is to monitor your learning with Bloom's. Ask yourself, which level do you typically learn at, and try and move up Bloom's. How do you move up Bloom's? The remaining metacognition skills are the tickets you need to help you. All of these skills that I'll talk about from here on out involve active learning. So ask yourself, do you read or listen to lectures passively? How frequently do you read a page and then kind of wake up and wonder what you just read? Or listen in class only to have no idea what was discussed? I didn't know whether to smile or shake my head when I came across a research study, a pretty simple research study, where after a large lecture, researchers simply asked students what the lecture topic was as they left class. About a third knew. So a lot of passive learning going on, at least in that class that day. Point being that you want to be much more active with your learning, and so embracing the metacognition skills will help you move in that direction. For all of your studies, develop the habit of intensely studying with intense study sessions. Interleave those study sessions. What that means is study each course each day and study all the material in each course each day. Ask yourself, when you finish a topic in your courses, do you continue to learn it by testing yourself, or forget about it until the exam? If you're like most of my students, I think about 99% of them would say they forget about a topic until right before the exam and then revisit it. So a better study approach is intense study sessions where you're continuously going back and studying material that you've previously learned. Most of the experts say to use intense 30 to 50 minute sessions. You should experiment with that. One expert said she used 90-minute sessions, so experiment and see what works well for you. If you need some help or some guidance, this Pomodoro technique is pretty widely used, And it helps address procrastination, which many of us could use some help with. If you Google it, it'll pop right up and you can learn how to employ this technique. It's pretty straightforward and helpful, I've found. Question then is, what should you do during your interleaved intense study sessions? Well, you want to employ the metacognition skills that we'll talk about, but another way to look at that is you do not want to just read, reread, and reread either your text or your course handouts. A lot of my students do that, and you become very familiar with the words or the notes, but you're still functioning, if you think about it, at these lower levels of blooms. So you want to have intense study sessions and then employ the metacognition skills that we'll talk about. One of the first skills that you can implement is to preview material with questions. Ask yourself, do you tend to just show up at a class or just start reading textbook material with little preparation? If so, give up that habit. Instead, what you want to start doing is actively preview the day's course material by asking questions. And the questions you want to ask should be why, how, and what if questions, because those questions will help you move up blooms to the higher levels. Skim both your textbook and your lecture notes before class. It's a widely held misconception, I think, that most students think they learn everything in class. I don't know an instructor who thinks that's true, never met one. Oftentimes there are example problems or assigned problems, and you should try to look at them beforehand to solve them. You may not be able to because you are just exposing yourself to the new information and new knowledge. But if you can't solve them, use them to generate questions. And then if you're doing this, previewing for questions, the obvious next step is to listen in class or read your textbook for answers to these questions. It's much more active learning. Do so with intense study sessions. Write all your notes and questions by hand. Write your preview questions by hand. Take lecture notes by hand. Writing helps you by hand, helps you assimilate information, which helps you to move up blooms. Research shows, in contrast, that students who use their computers for note-taking tend to mindlessly type everything they hear or see without thinking about it. So it's very inactive, and they end up passively gaining some knowledge, but not getting much out of the time that they've put in. So write your notes by hand. Let's practice that. So here's a passage. It's from an intermediate accounting textbook that I use in one of my upper level classes. You may not know a thing about accounting or a thing about corridor amortization, and that's okay. That's not the point. We want to ask ourselves some preview questions about this passage, a couple paragraphs here. First and foremost, most of my students wouldn't bother to preview before they started reading this or before I started talking about this in class. But those that did, the few that did, would probably highlight corridor amortization. They might highlight corridor approach, and they might highlight this sentence because it's bolded. And so again, that's very passive. What you want to do to preview is you want to ask yourself some why, how, and what if questions. So what would be an example of some questions you might ask? Well, basic, easy preview question would be, why use corridor amortization? How does corridor amortization work? If you previewed and happened to read this bolded sentence at the bottom, it says above that size, the accumulated OCI account related to gains and losses is too large and must be amortized. You might ask, what if the accumulated balance becomes too large? And then again, that sentence may not have any meaning to you, but it would to an accounting major after they studied this topic. The point being, don't highlight, preview by asking questions and writing them down. How, why, and what if questions are best because they help you move up blooms. Your learning will be much more active. And then you go to class or read the rest of the textbook and the surrounding material looking for answers to those questions. Read and listen cumulatively. So develop this habit. It's very easy. The idea is to read a sentence, or at your choice, maybe you read a paragraph or a section of a book, depending on the complexity, and ask yourself, how does this sentence or perhaps paragraph or section relate to the prior sentence, paragraph, or section? The idea then is you're building as you read by actively in your mind relating the new sentence or the new paragraph to what you've already read. When I suggest this to students, initially they're going to go, well, they always do, Prof, that's a lot of work, it'll take forever. And when they try it, they report to a person that it saves them time. It saves them time because they're much more actively reading and they remember what they're reading, and it generates questions, so they're functioning at a higher level faster. While you're reading cumulatively, you're also asking your why, how, and what if questions, so you move up blooms. You may be answering, hopefully are answering, your preview questions, and you're handwriting everything. You should practice this with something important to you. You can use this corridor amortization passage that's in the prior slide, but probably better if you pick something off your desk, say a page in length, and just try cumulatively reading it and see how it works for you. The first time you try it, you might be surprised at how well you remember that material, and you find you don't need to read it again. You can move on to using that information, applying it or evaluating it or analyzing it, the higher level Bloom's learning skills. But stop and give that a try for a few minutes. If you're previewing for questions and reading cumulatively, you're probably already starting to minimize your highlighting, but if not, do so. It's very passive learning. And so instead of highlighting, which a lot of my students do, preview for questions. Use your intense study sessions. What do you do after you read a passage or after class? At the end of your intense study session or at the end of class, use the 30-second rule. Take out a sheet of paper, take out a pen and pencil, and in 30 seconds, write down the important concepts and the important ideas from that class or from the section of the textbook you just read. You'll find it helps you to remember everything and brings forth questions that you need to seek answers to fill in gaps in your knowledge. At some point shortly thereafter attending class, you want to read your notes, but you want to read your notes actively, not just to memorize them. Read them to fill in gaps, and do so by hand. Write out your new questions. Okay, so you're reading your notes, but notice that you're not just reviewing to remember, which again is one of the lower levels of learning on Bloom's. You're actively moving up Bloom's by filling in gaps and writing out new questions. In your intense study sessions, chunk information and place it in context by concept. Here's the idea. I'm going to draw a few boxes here. And the idea is to write down in your notes what you consider the concept that you're studying, and then what are the chunks of knowledge that support that concept. So you're organizing the material actively as you study. So let's take a look at that a little bit closer. I'm going to go back to this corridor amortization passage. We don't have time to read the whole thing, nor the interest probably. Let's just take this first sentence and see how it might work. So the concept, you might say, is corridor amortization. You don't know a thing about it, but that's okay. And the first sentence says, the asset gains and losses and the liability gains and losses can offset each other. So you might initially organize that information as the concept would be corridor amortization, and one chunk might be asset gain or loss netted or offset, and liability gain or loss netted. And then these two things net. So you might draw in another chunk in here to net assets and liabilities, however you want to organize it. The key then is recognize as you understand material better and learn more, you're becoming more of an expert at it. And experts have created large chunks around concepts in their mind. So if you think about me, if you came up and asked me about, say, pension accounting, you might find out, to your chagrin, that I could talk for several hours or more about pension accounting. I could talk about the history. I could talk about the future, where they're thinking of changing it, different problems, where students succeed, fail. All this stuff comes into my head, but that's a result of years of chunking. So you're forewarned. Don't ask me about pension accounting. But for me, I might have a concept here, and I might just say the concept for me is pension accounting, and then one chunk is corridor amortization. So my chunking would be different because I have more experience. So as you study with your intense study sessions, start off organizing the material as seems reasonable, and then recognize as you learn more, you want to reorganize it into larger concepts and larger chunks as you become familiar and work with it. Okay? I may be an expert, I hope, in accounting, financial accounting, but clearly not everything. If you asked me about my Spanish language skills, it's a skill I'm starting to develop. I'd like to learn Spanish. You'd find out right away I have very few small chunks, much fewer and smaller than I would like. So as I learn Spanish as a novice, I'm starting with a lot of small concepts and small chunks, and then over time hoping to reorganize that knowledge in my head into larger chunks and larger concepts. Okay? Metacognition skill, context and chunking. You're doing that in intense study sessions. Also in your intense study sessions, paraphrase. Develop this habit. Teach or explain these topics to others or to your stuffed animals. It helps with your organization, your retrieval, your chunking, and identifying concepts. I encourage students to work in groups because it facilitates paraphrasing. They explain problems and concepts to one another. And it's no surprise that the groups that I have that work well together oftentimes will all come to an office hour together and take turns asking questions and build off of each other's questions. They're paraphrasing, and they tend to perform better on the exam as a result. Even if one group member comes and the others don't, the one group member tends to talk for the group as a whole and say, so-and-so thought this, I thought that, da-da-da-da. So there's a lot of paraphrasing going on with students, my students who work in groups. So I'd strongly encourage you to work within a group if at all possible. Okay? Tie everything that you learn to what you already know. Actively relate new material to what you already know. It facilitates your context and your chunking. Your remembering is better. And so that passage that I showed you was called corridor amortization. The accounting students that would show up in my class should know what amortization is, but they're unfamiliar with corridor amortization. So they should tie this new concept, corridor amortization, to a familiar concept for them, amortization. And they'd find that there's a lot of overlap in how it works, but not everything. There's some new concepts there too. Throughout all of your studies, always test yourself. You learn more by testing yourself. It helps you assimilate information, it helps you retrieve information, and it identifies gaps in your knowledge. Of course, to test yourself, you have to have questions. So presumably, you've been previewing for questions, so you've developed a number on your own. But also with textbooks, you have problems at the end of a chapter, some assigned, some not. You can do them all. And then many textbooks have an online support website that has numerous problems. Professors provide practice exams. Use them all to test yourself. Initially, when I suggest this to students, rather than read and reread and reread the textbook, instead test yourself, they're not that committed to this strategy. If you're not, or you're thinking, I'll try, but then go read this little article, How Tests Make Us Smarter, in the New York Times. New York Times allows you to download a small number of articles for free, so you should be able to download it. And I think that'll convince you that this metacognition skill is a ticket to better learning and better grades if that's important to you. Continuing this idea of always testing yourself, solve your textbook and your practice exam problems without looking at the solutions. If you ask students at this point, are mistakes at this point either good or bad? Most students will say mistakes are good at that point because you identify gaps in your knowledge, any misunderstandings are identified before taking the exam, and of course then there's time to address them. But carry this idea even a step further. When you finish a problem, only check the bottom line answer. If your answer is wrong, focus on finding your mistake without using the solution. It will help you identify gaps in your knowledge. If your answer is correct, compare your approach to the solution approach and evaluate any differences. So always test yourself. A number of people use the notion of a memory palace. If you've not heard of this, it's kind of an intriguing idea. Give it a try sometime. The idea is to take a geographic space. So that might be your favorite street that you know well. And then if you have a series of items that you need to remember that you're just learning, mentally place these items throughout the street. And then to remember these items, just mentally walk down your street. Initially, students are a little skeptical of that, but this is the method that the memory experts, the worldwide memory experts, use to memorize, who knows, 5 decks of cards or hundreds of numbers or whatever they do. Anyway, this method has a long history. If you're interested in it, there's a Wikipedia article that's pretty intriguing. And you might actually use this method to help you learn and remember and employ the metacognition skills that we're talking about right now. Use exam wrappers. The idea is the following. Most of my students will just look at their exam scores and they're either happy or they're not. Instead, evaluate your performance with the goal to improve your future learning. So ask yourself, approximately how much time did I spend on the material tested on the exam? Was it an appropriate amount of time? Okay, given the complexity and the breadth of the exam. What percentage of my time was spent on best practices, previewing, solving homework problems without reviewing solutions first, etc. So evaluate your performance with an idea of improving it next time. It might be good to take a look at an example, and this is a pretty intriguing one. This is from a psychology professor at USC. He was teaching introductory psychology, and he had a student who earned exceptionally high exam scores, and he was curious, so he asked that student how he studied, and the student responded. So take a look at what this student did relative to the metacognition skills that we've talked about, and perhaps relative to how you learn. He said he always does the reading prior to a lecture. So it's probably got most of my students and me when I was in college right there. He anticipates test questions and their answers as he reads. See how active his learning is? He answers rhetorical questions in his head during lectures to test his retention of the reading, reviews study guides, takes the practice test to discover which concepts he doesn't know and makes a point to learn them. Notice this one, reorganizes the course information into a study guide of his own design. This student was chunking. Spaces out his review and practice over the duration of the course, and a couple other things there that you can read. Point being that this student scored very high. He had developed excellent metacognition skills, and they were paying huge dividends for him. Do you want more motivation? I think motivation's misunderstood, so do a number of other people. And so you might take 22 minutes, go to this YouTube address, and listen to an interview of Mel Robbins talk about motivation, and see if it changes your view and helps you to be a little more motivated if that's something you need. As you listen to this YouTube video, focus on the process of learning and building the process of learning, not necessarily or not just the outcome. The idea is to build good processes. Those are the metacognition skills that you should implement. And so they're easy to keep track of and they're doable. There's plenty of room to grow because the research in this area on metacognition shows that most of us don't employ the metacognition skills. For example, if you look at this chart on the right of the screen here, clearly students think they should assess the task assigned in a class, but research shows they don't. Clearly students think they should evaluate their strengths and weaknesses, and they do, but they overestimate their strengths. And in particular, the worse their performance, the more they overestimate. Students agree they should plan, but they either don't or do it poorly. They clearly should apply better learning strategies, but they often just don't. And they should reflect on their performance, maybe using exam wrappers, but typically they don't. So plenty of room for improvement there. That's it. If you want to develop these skills, the best time to start is right now. And the best way to start is in approximately 30 seconds, write down the important concepts of metacognition that you've been exposed to or seen in this screencast. If you listen to the Mel Robbins video, then this will make sense to you. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, start now. And I would add to that, enjoy.